Hi, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the buyer exclusive rodent control webinar. Today, we are very lucky to have experts from Germany and Malaysia to talk about rodent control and science behind the rodenticide technology. Now, before I pass the session off to Farouk, let me just introduce myself. My name is Dian, and I'm a communications manager with environmental science based in Singapore. Now, let's go through the session format for today. It'll be 2 hours starting at 3. All your video and audio have been disabled, so please type your questions into the Q&A chat box, and we will respond to these questions during the Q&A. Now, there will be a survey available to you before you leave the event, so please feel free to participate before you leave the webinar. And the entire session today will be recorded, so within 48 hours, we will give today's audience a copy of the replay URL. Now, without further delay, I will hand it over to Farouk. Farouk?
Hello, I'm audible, Dian. Thank you, Dian. Hello, and a very good afternoon to all the planters. I hope that all of you are doing well and healthy. Thank you for joining us today, and I would like to welcome everyone to Bayer exclusive webinar on the rodenticide in oil palm plantations. My name is Farouk Roslan. I am a rural hygiene segment manager for the Bayer Environmental Science Malaysia, and I'll be moderating to this webinar. Today, we are very honored to have two distinguished speakers who are expert in their field. Let me introduce you to our first speaker, which we bring to you today virtually all the way from Germany, Dr. Stefan Endepols. He is currently our senior biologist, rodent management, and SPP of Bayer Crop Science based in Monheim, Germany. He is specialized in the field study of rodenticide and rodent management. Hi, Dr. Stefan. Good morning to you, and thank you for joining us today. Okay, next speaker, I will be introducing you, Mr. Gan Giwun. Mr. Gan is the Assistant Vice President 1 of the Sime Darby Plantation Agribio Sdn Bhd, based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Mr. Gan has more than 30 years of experience in R&D work on soil, water management, crop protection, and also plant nutrition. He is now responsible for the sales and marketing of research spin-off products and other agriculture products for oil palm plantation. Hello, Mr. Gan. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, we're moving on. Just a reminder to all the participants, if you want to ask a question to our speaker, please type it in the chat box and we will address after their presentations. I hope that you will be enjoying the 2 day sessions, and please stay tuned with me until the end of this webinar as we will run some quizzes and definitely prizes are waiting for the winners. Now, let's kick off our first session. I would like to invite Dr. Stefan for his presentation on the topic of rodenticide technology. Dr. Stefan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me well. Farouk?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So I think I can start my presentation. Yes, thank you, Farouk, for introducing myself. I have nothing to add. Just saying I'm a biologist working with rodents for some decades already. And I must admit, of course, that most of you probably are more familiar with oil palm rat and oil palm rat control than I am, because I am more focused on commensal rodents, Norway rats, roof rats, black rats, house mice, etc. And I have only once in my life I have been to some oil palm plantations. So therefore, please forgive me when in some cases I'm not completely correct, maybe. Also, I have got some support, of course, from my colleagues. Some of them I want to thank explicitly, which is Enkwe from Singapore and Jason Nash, and also some others of my colleagues who supported me very well and who teach me on oil palm rat control in Malaysia in particular. So I think we can start with the presentation now. Yes, thank you. This is just a very rough structure of my presentation. So I have two parts today. One deals with general rodent control products. So in particular, I will introduce the anticoagulants, which are the main product group for rodent control, commensal rodents and also field rodents like oilpalm rats. And then in the second part, I will dive a bit more into some specific issues on oilpalm rat control, oilpalm rat management. Next chart. Yeah. Next, please. So I think we have to press several times. Yeah, very general. I like to use this simple graph to introduce the topic. Rodent control or rodent management is a very sophisticated science, I must say, or a very sophisticated work. It is based on three main levels. The inner level of each product, of course, is the active ingredient, which is toxic to the rodent, and at the end of the day, it shall kill the rodent. But the active ingredient alone doesn't kill any rodent. In most cases, it requires a bait to be packaged in. And this bait, of course, must be taken by the rat. And before the rat takes the bait, it must decide to eat the bait. So that already makes it pretty complicated and difficult sometimes, you know. And even if the bait is good and most of rats probably decide to eat it, you need the practice, which means you need to bait the place at the right time, at the right amount, at the right locations, etc. All these things which are connected to good practice guidelines, to instructions, etc., which at the end are connected to the behavior of everyone who does rodent management. So whereas the bait is connected to the rat's behavior, the practice at the end is a mirror of the behavior of the pest manager, of the man. So therefore, this is the complex system. And if one is wrong in this system, it will not work and the rats will survive. So I think that must be understood before man starts to run a rodent control campaign. So the next chart, please. Yeah, so I start to talk about the active compounds. Next chart. Yeah, next. Yeah, so on the left side, you see the acute poisons. That means these are poisons which kill within a few minutes or 30 minutes maximum. There were some on the market, and these are pretty toxic compounds like nerve poisons, or also narcotics fall under this category. Chemostimulants, which is not an acute poison, to be honest, but a very, very long-acting poison group, which interferes with reproduction of the rodents. So, but it doesn't work, to be honest. And then very toxic, unspecific compounds like zinc phosphide, which is probably the most popular acute poison worldwide, zinc phosphide. And all of them are toxic to the rodents, of course, but they are not only toxic to the rodents, they are toxic to all mammals and birds, which makes it difficult to handle them. And there's no antidote available. So in case of an accident, there is no tool to treat the dog or the man or the monkey or whatever. And this is very, very dangerous, therefore. And another effect is what we call conditioned bait shyness. So it means the rats get symptoms of poisoning within a few minutes or seconds maybe, and therefore very quickly learn to avoid these compounds by observing their conspecifics or by observing themselves after taking a sublethal dose. So they will do it only once and never again. So therefore, it is very, very difficult to get good control results with these compounds. And on the other hand, they are very dangerous to everyone. Then on the right-hand side, you see biological products. So it has been tried several times to introduce bacterial products. Some of them can have an effect under certain circumstances. Myself, I was included in some research on Sarcocystis singaporensis, which is a small parasite transmitted by snakes, by the big snakes, and it's deadly to rodents. It works, but of course it's a bit more complicated to make good baits, because it's a living organism which must be provided to the rats, and that makes it difficult to make good baits and to handle them. But under certain circumstances, actually it can work. Other attempts didn't work very well, I must admit. So then we come to the main group, which are the subacute compounds, mainly the anticoagulants. So these compounds don't show any symptoms of intoxication after 1 or 2 days, after hours, there's nothing. Only after a few days they start to work visible. And we have 2 groups of the anticoagulants. The second generation, which is also called the single dose anticoagulants, which are more toxic. And the multiple dose anticoagulants, or also called first generation anticoagulants, these are a bit less toxic, and they potentiate their efficacy after repeated ingestions. And then more or less new calciferols, also called vitamin D. This is a completely different mode of action, and Bayer and BASF have done some efforts to get this compound registered on a more or less global basis, and we have started to introduce our products by the end of the last year. So this is also a pretty well-known rodenticides for decades already, but now it's revitalized and it's registered and authorized in many countries of the world. And maybe we can introduce in future a product also for palm rat control containing vitamin D3 cholecalciferol. So next chart, please. Yeah, please don't worry about all the details of this chart. It's biochemistry, and it's just to explain very roughly how the anticoagulants work. You know, for example, blood coagulation depends on vitamin K. So vitamin K is required to keep the balance in blood coagulation. And blood coagulation happens all the time on a microscopic level. It does not work only when you cut your skin and the blood is flooding out. It's also done in the body at every second on a very microscopic basis. And for all these processes, vitamin K is required. During this process, vitamin K is oxidized, and what's then there is the vitamin K epoxide, and this is recycled. On the left-hand side, you see the vitamin K hydroquinone, and for this recycling process, I think it's 100 or 200 times each molecule can be used. For this recycling process, an enzyme is required. This enzyme is called the vitamin K epoxide reductase. And now it comes to the anticoagulants, which in their structure look very similar to this enzyme. And once there is a poisoning with anticoagulants, the anticoagulant replaces the enzyme in this process, but it doesn't work. So this recycling process of vitamin K is interrupted. And that's at the end deadly for the rodent after 4, 5, 7, 8 days. Just to introduce the mode of action very roughly. Next, please. Yeah, why do we use, or why do we prefer anticoagulants and also calciferols over the other compounds? One is the delayed action. Of course, some people say, oh, I want to see the dead rodent after 1 day already. But as I just tried to explain, rats learn, and the longer the action is of the compound, the lower is the chance for the rodent to learn. Therefore, these products are so successful because they have a delayed action, and they kill the rodent only after 3 days or a week maybe. So therefore, the rodents cannot develop any kind of bait shyness. Then, also very important, there is no taste or odor in this compound, so the rodents can't detect it in the bait. They can't see, or they can't smell, or they can't taste if a bait is poisonous or not. They can't detect it. More or less, and that's of course a problem, these compounds are rodent-specific toxic, so they are not toxic for many other organisms. But of course, they are toxic to other mammals and also to some birds. It depends on the compound. In particular, second generation compounds are pretty toxic to birds. The first generation compounds are much less toxic to birds. Nevertheless, they are most toxic to rodents, and if they are used with care, environmental hazards can be reduced largely. And of course, an advantage of these compounds is an antidote is available. As I told you, these toxic compounds compete with the vitamin K epoxide reductase and therefore reduce the vitamin K content in the blood. And this can be compensated pretty easily by administering vitamin K1. So once a dog is poisoned, the vet just infuses some vitamin K. The most vets have this on stock, and they can rescue the dog. So more or less pretty easy compared to other toxic compounds. So therefore, more or less all the world relies on these compounds. Yeah, okay, yes, next chart is good. Great. So the main compounds of the first generation are warfarin and cumatetrol. And as you can see on the numbers, when these compounds were introduced, they are pretty old. So these are very, very traditional compounds on the market worldwide since the 50s, more or less. Cumatetrol is the compound of Bayer, introduced in the year 1957, so even before I was born. And the other one is warfarin, which is even older than cumatetrol. The numbers here you see are numbers which express the toxicity in the LD50 in terms of milligram poison per kilogram rat. LD50 means this is the dose expressed in milligram poison per kilogram rat, which is required to kill 50% of the rats. So it's a statistical value. And as you can see, cumatetrol is a bit more toxic than warfarin. For warfarin, this value is in between 10 to 60 milligram per kilogram approximately. And for cumatetrol, it's in the range of 10 to 30 milligram per kilogram. But the intelligent effect of this group of compounds is their multiple dose effect. So you see in the right column, you see the numbers, how much of this poison is required when the rat gets a small dose every day over 5 days. And then for warfarin, it's only 5 days, 0.8 milligram per kilogram per day. And for cumatetrol, it's even lower. It's only 0.3 milligram per kilogram per day on 5 succeeding days. And if you multiply these numbers, you see it's in the range of 2 milligram only. So which means when a rodent takes these compounds on some succeeding days, the efficacy or the toxicity of these compounds is potentiated by factor 10. So therefore, it's so important that rats have access to bait for a number of days. So that makes these compounds much more efficient than getting only one dose into the rat. So we can say it's a kind of intelligent mode of action. Yes, next is good. The next shows you all the second generation compounds, and there we have 5 compounds. And even these compounds are not new on the market. So most of them were introduced during the 70s, which also is almost 50 years ago, 40, 50 years. And there are 2 subgenerations, we could say. Bromadiolone and difenacum are less toxic than rodifacum, flucumorphen, and difethialone. So the later 3 are the most potent rodenticides which have ever been on the market. And as you can see on the numbers expressing the LD50 in milligram poison per kilogram rat, you see it's an 0.2 or 0.3 milligram of the poison required to kill 1 kilogram of rat in terms of the LD50. There is no multiple dose effect. They are so toxic that it can't be potentiated. And the first part of the second generation, bromadiolone and difenacum, are a bit less toxic than these most potent ones. They are toxic in the range of almost 2 milligram per kilogram rat. So it's a difference between these 2 subgroups of second generation compounds. And of course, in terms of killing rats, you will like compounds which are very toxic. But on the other hand, of course, these compounds are also very toxic to other organisms, not only to rats, they are also very toxic to birds and of course to other mammals, which makes it more complicated to use them. It's no problem, and I would prefer them to kill mice inside a building, inside a bakery or grain mill or whatever. Of course, we can take these compounds because there is no exposition of other wildlife. But using them in the open area is a very risky process. Next, please. Yeah, these are just the same compounds. I compare here the LD50 values for rat and for mouse. I don't know why some numbers are blue. They should be red, indicating that rats and mouse have developed resistance to these compounds, in particular to bromadiolone and difenacum, whereas in particular protifacum and difethialone, and probably in most cases flucomorphine, are not resistant by Norway rats, roof rats, or house mice, and also not by field rodents, of course. So bromadiolone, difenacum, some resistant strains exist worldwide, but protifacum, flucomorphine, and difethialone still, or probably forever, are the most toxic, and they are so toxic that there is no serious resistance in the world. Next, please. Yeah, and to finish this chapter on toxicity, I have compared racumine, cumachatril, and on the other hand, protifacum, which is the most toxic one. Racumine usually is contained in the bait at 0.038%, and protifacum, due to its high toxicity, of course, is used in a much lower concentration, only at 0.005%. And if we now calculate how toxic is this bait to a rat, just calculate it based on one single ingestion, and then we see to achieve the LD50, which means a 50% chance that the rat will die, we will require 12 grams of the racumine bait, but only 2 grams of the protifacum bait. So that's a difference by a factor of 5, 6. Yeah, but if the rat gets the chance to eat the bait on several days, you see the right column, the same amount of bait is required to kill the rat. It doesn't make a difference if the rat eats on 5 succeeding days 0.3 gram or maybe 0.5 gram of a racumine bait or of a protifacum bait. So the toxicity of these baits after 5 days is the same due to this multiple dose effect in cumachatril. So, and this is important to understand if you use these products in rodent control campaigns. Next, please. Yeah, this actually shows the same principle, how much bait is required. And if you look to the left chart, which is a single feed anticoagulant, if the bait is more or less palatable and the rats gets access to it, they will ingest a lethal dose on the first day already, indicated by the blue arrow. But they continue to eat for at least 3, maybe 4, 5 further days. So at the end, they are dramatically overkilled, as you see in this chart, because they have ingested the lethal dose already on the first day, but they eat for another 3, 4, 5 days. And during all that time, they run around for a week or so till they die. And that means they are our danger for animals which feed on rats, barn owls, foxes, etc., are very much endangered, because killing such a rat, they will ingest a multiple LD50, which is inside the rat. This risk is lower when using a multiple dose compound, which you can see on the right-hand chart. When the lethal dose is achieved only after 2 or maybe 3 days. Here on this graph, we just say after 3 days they have ingested the lethal dose, and therefore the dose inside the animal is much less dangerous to every predator or raptor eating a rat. And that's the reason why any campaigns on responsible use of rodent products recommend, if possible, if they are effective, use first generation multiple feed compounds, because they pose a much lower risk to predators, scavengers, owls, foxes, and other animals. Next, please. Yeah, and then I've been asked very frequently, what about the time to death after starting eating on the bait? We have gone to some of our laboratory trials we have conducted over a large period, and we found that there is almost no difference. So here you see on the left-hand side, you see the percent of animals, of rats, which have been killed after a certain number of days, which you see on the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 13 days. And we see the black bars show raccoon bait, and most rats died between day 4 and day 7 or day 8 after starting ingesting the bait. And the same type of trial conducted with Protifacum bait. Interestingly, most animals died after 6 days, and the lethal period was much more prolonged, up to 12 days. We don't know why that is the case, because certainly they have ingested a lethal dose at the start of the treatment after 1 or 2 days, but it takes so long time until they die. Maybe it's connected to the low concentration of the active ingredient in the bait, so therefore not that high number of enzymes molecules are blocked, but it's only a theory. So at the end, it kills all rats, irrespectively if it's a raccoon bait or a Protifacum bait. But the time to death in both cases takes some days, and it's even longer for Protifacum in our trials than for raccoon. Next, please. Next, yeah. Yeah, or we can skip this. This is a summary of what I just told you. Next, please. Yeah, now we come to the topic of toxicity or risks, hazard to non-target animals, and there are 2 different kinds of toxicity. One is what we just call non-target poisoning. That means non-target animals, for example, a monkey finds the bait and eats it, or a dog or whatever, and gets poisoned by that way. And more complicated and more dangerous at the end is what we call secondary poisoning. So that means, as I say here, secondary poisoning occurs when an animal consumes a rodent which has eaten bait. For example, when an owl eats a poisoned rat. And that's the main problem whenever rodenticides are used in the open field. Next, please. Yeah, here this is a collection of secondary poisoning studies which were published in the scientific literature for all these compounds. And I don't want to go into the details. On the left column, you see the mortality in owls, which have been fed poisoned rats or mice for a certain period, which you see in the second column. And on the right column, you see what type of poisoned rodents they have ingested. And as you can see here, in particular for bromadiolon, Protifacum, and flucomorphen, a very high percentage of owls was killed in these studies. And for cumatetilo, which is known to be less hazardous to birds, 0 mortality occurred in barn owls. This is a study which was conducted in Malaysia by Professor Lee from the Coconut Research Board. That was when I was to Malaysia, when they started this trial, which you see in the second row, which with a feeding period of 6 days. So they have received 1 poisoned rats every day over a period of 6 days, or even two rats sometimes. So next chart, please. Yeah, this is just a summary of the study Professor Lee conducted in Malaysia. So the rats were fed for 3 days with raccoon exclusively, so they were killed, or probably they were overkilled after 3 days eating only raccoon. That means each rat has taken at least 30 gram raccoon bait. And then these rats were fed to the owls for 6 days. and then the owls were observed for another 30 days, and we found no mortality. Also, these owls had consumed a huge amount of poisoned rats. So this was a good result, confirming that the hazard of this type of product is lower than for other products. We cannot say there is no hazard. We don't know what happens if an owl eats poisoned rats for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks or so. Certainly there will be a point of poisoning, but under these already pretty strong conditions, there was no effect. Next, please. Yeah, and this is one of the studies, and there are other studies around, and also studies on looking for residues in rats and mice, led to the conclusion by some organizations worldwide which deal with the protection of animals, which recommend compounds of the first generation like racumine or also warfarin to some extent for rodent control when there is an exposition of non-target predators and raptors. Next, please. Yeah, this is just an example I've taken from one of the presentations of working groups recommending these type of products. Here we see one bird protection group from Australia and another one, I think this is from South Africa. Yeah, next please. Yeah, now I jump into the second part of the presentation, which deals with oil palm rat control. And here again, as I'm not an expert in oil palm rat control, also I have learned some about it, mainly from my colleagues and from other colleagues and scientists. It's just to give a short overview on the main topics here. 4 topics I will touch in this part of the presentation, which is sustainable palm oil production, rodent control, in particular the use of racumine for sustainable palm oil production, and yeah, at the end, as we are as a bio company, we want to support this type of sustainable agriculture in Malaysia, and I think my colleagues do it or have done it already for a few years. Sustainable palm oil production, what does that mean? There are definitions, of course, from international organizations. Here is the definition from the United Nations, which says development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Yeah, sustainable development is only achievable through a long-term commitment to maintaining the proper balance of the following considerations: economic, social, and environment. Yes, and that's it. Speaking in our case, of course, you want to get as much as possible oil from your plantations, but on the other hand, you don't want to damage other parts of the nature, in particular other mammals or birds, in the case of rodenticides. Next, please. Yeah, now I come to your organization, the RSPO, which has defined 8 principles of sustainable palm oil production, which meets these United Nations categories: commitment to transparency, compliance with local laws and regulations, commitment to long-term economic and financial viability, use of appropriate best practices by growers and millers. So therefore I have inserted here a green bar, because this of course is also connected to rodent control. Then also connected to the rodent control is the next item: environmental responsibility and conservation of natural resources and biodiversity, responsible consideration of employees, responsible development of new plantations, and again, the last point important in connection to rodent management is commitment to continuous improvement in key areas of activity. So if you go through these main principles defined by the RSPO, there are at least 3 which are directly connected to rodent management in oil palm plantations. Next, please. Yeah, and this is a special chapter on the use of agrochemicals in oil palm production. And which are the indicators? Justification of all agrochemical use, records of pesticide use, documentation that World Health Organization type 1A or 1B and paraquat is reduced and or limited. So that means use the less toxic compounds and not the most toxic ones. And then another important statement here is use of selective products that are specific to the target pest, weed or disease, and which have minimal effect on non-target species should be used where available. So that means even if there's a very potent compound to run a control campaign against pest animals or other organisms, you should use that one which has the lowest hazard to all other parts of the nature. Chemicals should only be applied by qualified person, of course, and that goes back to my very first chart. Rodent management is a very sophisticated procedure, and actually it requires people who very well understand rodent biology, and also who understand environment. And therefore, I think that the most experienced persons in this field are also the most successful persons, or the most trained persons are the most successful persons, which some of you probably know from your own activities. Next, please. Next. Yeah, a few words about rodent control in oil palm plantations with more details. You know, the main species here is Bathus theomanicus, also called the oil palm rat, as far as I know. Unfortunately, I don't know the Malaysian expression. It feeds on developing fruit branches and fruit which falls to the ground. Also, I must admit, I don't know what they like more, if they prefer to eat on the top of the tree or they prefer to collect fruits on the ground. I don't know. Without rodent control, populations of rat can be in the order of 200 to 600 individuals per hectare. So, and that's much, of course. If there are 500 rats on 1 hectare of palm plantation, we can imagine they will eat a lot, and then it's a real economic loss. Next, please. Yeah, what type of rodenticide baits are available for these purposes? Yes, warfarin was introduced in 1953, and it's on the market now for more than 70 years. And the single feed anticoagulants were introduced mainly in the 90s, but also some in the 70s and 80s. And you may know that protifacum, bromadil, and flucomorphin also used in oil palm plantations. And the first generation compounds, warfarin and cumaceterol. And in terms of bait type, yes, there are many bait types available on the world, and even Bayer provides several types of bait. But for this purpose of applying bait in the free open area, the wax block is the most appropriate one because it's mold resistant and wet resistant. Therefore, I guess all these products more or less are wax block type. Next, please. Biological control also plays a role, of course, and then the main animal used for biological control is the barn owl. And as far as we know, it can collect up to 1,000 rodents per year, which is a huge number. With expansion in the planted area of oil palm, their population has increased, largely due to their being a more abundant food source. So yes, that means when there are continuous rat infestations, of course, then the population of barn owls also increases. But on the other hand, if the population of rats is reduced considerably, probably the population of barn owls will go down. So they follow, of course, the abundance of rats. Now it comes to the secondary poisoning issue, which I tried to explain in the first part of my presentation. The barn owl is at greater risk from the single feed rodenticides due to the higher potency of the active ingredients, as well as from secondary poisoning caused by build-up of rodenticide residues. So that means, of course, there are residues in the rat, and the barn owl collecting rats, maybe one rat each day or one poisoned rat each 3 days or so, residues will build up in the barn owl as well, and that could be very dangerous at the end of the day. Therefore, efforts have been on finding alternatives to the single feed rodenticides that then can be equally effective but with less impact on non-target organisms. And that comes when Bayer and maybe also other companies thought about revitalizing and exploiting the first generation multiple feed compounds, because also they're almost harmless. Please don't use the expression harmless. They are dangerous compounds still, but they are much less dangerous in terms of residues and secondary toxicity than some other compounds. Next, please. Yeah, I still come back to the anticoagulants, and I think now I repeat myself. They are slow acting, taking action not before 3 days. The symptoms you may know: animals start to eat less, they get fatigue, apathy, staggering gait, and they die within 3 to 8 days. Sometimes it takes 10 or 12 days. And most important, because and that's the reason why these compounds are so successful in global markets, there's no bait shyness, because rodents cannot detect these compounds in the bait. Next, please. Yeah, just in a summary, what is the comparison of single dose anticoagulants versus multiple feed anticoagulants? Single dose anticoagulants, a single feed may be sufficient. It must not be. Some rats take very small amounts of bait, and it takes 2 or 3 days to get a lethal dose into them. Other rats like to eat very much at once. They will certainly ingest the lethal dose within one dinner. It's very slowly metabolized, and rats continue feeding over several days because poisoning symptoms appear only after some days. Feeding declines towards death, of course. The rats die within 3 to 8 days, and there is some risk of secondary poisoning due to the residues and the high residue levels in rodents. Examples are protifacum, bromadiolone, and flucomorphin. Multiple feed anticoagulants, yeah, we have seen in many trials that some rats start to eat very high amount of bait, and these rats will ingest the lethal dose within a few hours. Other rats take only very small meals, and they need 3 or 4 days to get a lethal dose into their body. They are more rapidly metabolized, so the half-life values, which is the time of residues stay in the body, is much shorter than for the single-dose anticoagulants. In terms of poisoning symptoms, etc., time to death, it's almost the same. And due to their faster metabolism and lower residues and lower toxicity to non-targets, also the secondary poisoning risk is lower. So the main compounds on the market here are warfarin and cumatetrol. Next, please. Yeah, this is a chart of some studies we conducted or researchers conducted using these products with two two species of rats, Rattus argentiventer and the oil palm rat, Rattus theomanicus. In this chart, if you look, I don't want to go too much into the details. It just compares several products which have been tested, and what we can see here, the levels of consumption are almost the same for all baits. So the rats consumed 5-point-something gram of bait per day. And the mortality days, which means what is the mean period until the rats die, also is almost the same for all products. It's 4.4 or 5 days. So it's a very, very little difference, which you will never see under field conditions. And that's true for both of these rat species, Rattus argentiventer and Rattus theomanicus. So actually, in terms of efficacy, this data, which we got from the Agricultural University in Indonesia, there's no difference. You will not see any difference under field conditions. Next, please. Yeah, I think I'm almost through now. This is a summary of what I call what I told already on secondary poisoning. What is primary poisoning? What is secondary poisoning? I think I've explained this in detail now, and it's clear. Secondary poisoning is the issue. What people look for now, not only in Malaysia, also in Europe and in the US. And due to the residues of the second generation compounds and secondary poisoning effects in barn owls and other birds of prey, second generation compounds are much under pressure and are used only with restrictions in most parts of the world meanwhile. Next, please. Yeah, that's the conclusion at the end. Also, Bayer, of course, has access to other compounds. We sell difethialone, bromadiolone products in several countries, which are more toxic than racumine. But for all kinds of open field use against field rodents, and in particular in oil palms, because these are huge surfaces and a lot of wildlife and biological control by barn owls in it, we recommend not to use these more toxic second generation compounds, but to use racumine products. And we work on these products, and maybe we can provide even improved formulations within the next years, if that's possible. So next, please. And I think I'm through now. Yeah, okay, summary. Each presentation must end with a kind of summary. So first, a combination of natural predation and rodenticide baiting is often required to achieve satisfactory control of rodents. That means barn owls play a role in the long-term management of rodents. For RSPO accreditation, rodent control with minimal effect on non-target species, in particular barn owls, is an important criteria. Racumine has demonstrated both effective control and minimal risk to non-target species, like barn owls in oil palm plantations. Racumine is recommended by conservation groups due to their low hazard to non-target organisms. And racumine, of course, comes from a globally recognized R&D company with more than 5 decades of experience. So the rodent control and rodenticide experience in this company is older than I am. Yeah, I think I'm through now. And next chart, or is there anything else left over? I don't think so. Yes, I only can say thank you to all of you listening to this presentation, and I hope you have collected some new information, and I hope there are some questions which I can answer now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stefan, for the informative sharing, especially on the science and technical information about the rodenticides and also racumine wax block. that could be useful for the planters to consider as well for their plantations. So now I'll be picking the question from our participant. So Dr. Stefan, the first questions is from Su Chongming. So Dr. Stefan, is irregular baiting rounds who induce the bait shyness problem among the rodents?
Bait shyness is no problem as long as anticoagulants are used. There is no kind of bait shyness, so it has never been really observed. Of course, baiting very much depends on the quality of the bait, and it could be that baits are used which rats don't like or which they eat once and never again. But this is not connected to the active ingredient.
Okay, thank you. Second question from Mr. Tan Meng Kong. With the current labor shortage, can a more acute dose rather than subacute with multiple dose be adopted? And the second question followed by that is meaning that using first generation of poison but higher concentration of air in the bait.
The concentrations in the bait are the result of a long research in the laboratory and in the field. So not only Bayer, I think most of producers of rodenticide baits have adjusted the concentration in the bait to an optimum, which means not to have too much toxin in the bait, which also would render the bait more toxic for everybody, even including the people applying it. And on the other hand, keeping it at a level which is effective enough to kill and to be adapted to the rat's feeding behavior. And if you look into the rat's feeding behavior and the type of poisoning, it doesn't matter what the amount of active ingredient is ingested at the first day. It takes 3-4 days until the first symptoms appear. And even if the rat ingests a multiple lethal dose on the first day, it will stay healthy for another 3 days and ingest even more. So then it makes it to a very dangerous rat running around with maybe 5 or 10 lethal doses inside the body. And this should be prevented. And therefore the content of the active ingredients in the baits are adjusted to a very certain amount. And even for the second generation single dose compounds, we see that manufacturers reduce the content of the active ingredient because it is so dangerous. So, for example, Prodifacum for a long time have been sold with concentrations of 0.005%. But now, in particular in Europe, we can see that also due to the action of the authorities, more and more baits contain only 0.0025% active ingredient. So manufacturers reduce the amount of active ingredient in the bait by 50%. And still it's very effective. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Stefan. Next question is from Mr. Lai Chingnuk. For multi-feed anticoagulants, how many rounds are recommended to bring the rat population down?
Yeah, that's a topic we are working on together with some practitioners in the oil palm plantations, and we try to adjust the bait to bring down the rounds from, I think 4 or 5 is mostly recommended, to maximum 4. And that of course depends on the time interval between the rounds, the bait size of the bait or number of baits per tree. We work on that, and I think there are standards. I haven't introduced now. I have some data from recent trials indicating how many rounds are required, and I think we will come with more detailed recommendations, in particular when we come with this certain baits to the market and to the users. These trials are running. We have done some trials with our cooperators managed by Enquay this year, and further trials will run next year. And we hope to get some results indicating to reduce the number of rounds required for sufficient rodent control. I think
Okay, thanks, Dr.
for
Stefan.
each product there is a recommendation on the label of the product.
Okay, yeah. We have other questions from Kawei, asking a question about no effect of recumin on secondary poisoning trial. Is that including no internal bleeding caused to 1 hour as well?
Yeah. I think that the internal bleeding, that's the cause of death in all cases, primary poisoning, non-target poisoning, and also secondary poisoning. And in this trial, no bleeding, no effects of poisoning were observed in the owls. So they remained completely healthy even after 30 days of observation.
All right. Next question from Hugh Tinloy. Is neophobia, in the bracket of fear of new object, happens to rat?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, there are individual differences. So every rat is a bit different from the other rat, and some manufacturers have tried to develop very specific baits with some fantastic flavors and tastes. This sounds interesting and smells interesting, of course, but for the rat, it is something which we would expect to be surprising new. So once you come with a completely new smell or taste into the environment of the rat, most rats will be some kind of neophobic. So they will be skeptic and ask themselves, what's that? So I don't know that. I've never seen this type of texture, of smell, of taste, and therefore will start more careful to investigate this new source of food. So therefore, the best rat bait is one which is more or less similar to what the rat knows. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Okay. We have a few more questions before we end our Q&A. Maybe I just take the last two questions. Okay. Question from the Su Chongming again. What is your recommendation on the multiple baits applied per pump? Will it be more effective in controlling the rodents?
I must look into my detailed research data. I must admit I haven't these details on my screen now, but we have done, in particular, Enquay has managed some trials in Malaysia, so we can further look down into these data, whether it's 4 or 5, and I think if you, Faro, can make a note, we can send some information back to him on these details from recent trials.
Yeah, sure. Okay, maybe this will be the last question for you, Dr. Stefan. What is the best or suitable applications of the baits based on the season? I mean that based on the weather condition. The question from William Agustin. What is the best suitable application of the baits based on season?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Here it comes to the point where I must admit that I'm no expert in oil palm rat plantation rat control, because I'm sitting here in Germany, in the center of Europe, and my experiences in running campaigns in oil palms are very, very limited. Actually, I think you guys have more experience than myself. But again, I go back to my colleague in Singapore, and we can send you more information on that. But of course, from a theoretical standpoint, usually rat control is best when the availability of the natural food is limited. So when there's a lot of oil palm fruits ripened and falling down, I guess the competition is too strong for the bait. So you will get better results when the natural food is scarce and they really must search for food. Then they will take immediately the bait. So that's a better period. And of course, in terms of weather, very generally, of course, no bait likes rain. So even even we and all the other manufacturers try to stabilize their bait and to make them water protected, etc., they will not survive endless days of rain. So I think these are the two main points: not too much rain and not too much competitive feed for the rats, so that the feed competition is low for the bait. These two parameters must be taken into consideration to select the right period of bait application.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Stefan, and thank you for all the questions posted. That's the time that we have for the Q&A. Thank you so much, Dr. Stefan, for your sharing and also answers. All right. And now I think we should move to the quiz. All right. So you may use your mobile phone or other device to join the quiz. So I will ask all the participants to go to this menti.com and enter the code as shown on the screen now. Okay. So please go to www.menti.com on the website and type in the code 57028844 and type in your name. Okay, we are more people are coming in now. We are giving maybe 1 or 2 more minutes for others to log in into the quiz, so that more participants can join our quiz.
We're having more people.
Yeah.
Farouk will start.
Diane, can we start now?
Yeah.
I can see more people are coming in, still coming in.
Yeah. Let's start in this. Okay, Farouk, we have 45.
Okay.
Okay, we have 45. Okay, sorry, 45. Start now, okay? Oh.
Okay, I guess we start our quiz now.
Yes, we are starting now.
So the way to win the quiz is actually to score points by giving your answer quickly and giving your answer correctly. Okay, so that's for the leaderboard. Yay! Go, go. Okay, so are you guys okay? Let's go to the next question. Okay. Good job, Millie. Okay, so I'm going to the last question now. Anything as well? Very Bhagat, Bharat, I think question three should be the last one. Okay. Okay. MPMK, others to answer the last question. So, now. Okay. First prize is Biologist, everyone 4 points. Second is MPMK, and 108 points. Farhan, can you explain, is it the winner, the highest score, is it, or the first three?
The
Farooq?
top three winner, yeah, the top three winner.
Yes, okay, great. So because Fazli is our market sector in Indonesia, but can we get NMA people contact us at s.malaysia@bio.com and show us your screenshot of your placement, and we'll contact you regarding your how to claim your prize. Okay. So now we are. I'm gonna hand over back to you, Farooq, for Mr. Gan's presentation. Congratulations once again to everyone.
Okay, congratulations to all the winners. For the rest, please do not give up because we still have a second round of quiz after this presentation.